Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? Here on the Cowboy Time Story, we ride the stories of the West Campfire truths, trail dust memories, saloon whispers, gritty humans sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The wind came off the San Juan peaks like something with teeth. June Calloway braced her hip into the fence rail and brought the hammer down. Thud, thud. The nail skittered on frozen grain and bit her palm. Pitch bled from the pine. The south eave of the roof clicked in the gusts, a hairline seam that let the cold sing. Her breath fogged and was gone. A sound snapped from the lean-to coop, not complaint, panic. Wings hit wood. June dropped the hammer snow, swallowing her boots to the shins as she ran. The coop door bucked in the wind. A gray blur shot from the shadow with a braid of white feathers in its jaws. Coyote starved thin eyes like cut glass. She did not think. She grabbed the greener from the cabin wall, the metal biting through her glove. She stepped planted and fired from the hip. The boom slapped the trees. Snow puffed up and drifted back. The coyote folded a rag of fur on the white. The second hen flapped madly by the woodpile feet, scrabbling eyes wild. June scooped the dead bird still warm and stood over the coyote, a breath longer than she needed. Everything up here was hungry. Inside, smoke curled lazy in the low room. She set the hen on the table, plucked at the bench pin feathers singeing in the hearth heat. The smell was acrid and sweet. Her fingers were crack-stained with old blood and ash. The old music box on the shelf clicked when she wound it. No tune came, just a stubborn tick-off tempo against the wind. The knock did not come as a knock. It was a dead-weight pounding that shook the latch. June's hand went for the greener again. She stayed behind the door-line, eyes on the small pane glazed with rime. "Who is it?" Her voice was rough from cold and quiet. A scrape of gravel in a man's chest. Shelter. She wiped the frost with her sleeve. A mountain of a figure leaned into the frame, wrapped in iced pelts that turned him animal. His left shoulder was a black shine of frozen blood. His face, under the mat of hair and beard, looked carved hard and then broken by hard things. "Keep moving," June said. "I am not a boarding house. Not asking for a bed." The man's breath smoked. "One night, floor, I pay." He unshouldered a pack with his good arm. It hit the snow with a full sound. He fumbled the strap's stiff fingers clumsy, then hauled out a bundle of skins and tossed them at the door. They slumped heavy against the sill. Otter pelts, dark and dense prime winter take. 10 of them. The number sat in June's belly like heat, flour, kerosene, powder. The tack stamped in red on the ledger page down in red willow. She looked at the man again. He was swaying, dying on his feet. "Only the floor," she said. "I keep my gun. You keep your hands to yourself. You try me and you bleed out on my threshold." "Only the floor," he said. She lifted the bar. The wind shoved the door inward and brought him with it. Pine, old blood, wet fur, cold iron. He was bigger inside, like the room shrank to fit him. He stamped once failed and dropped to the packed earth by the fire with a clipped groan as his shoulder brushed the jamb. June barred the door again and stood until her heart came back down. Then she stoked the coals and set the pot with the scrawny hen. The man's eyes had closed, not sleep. Unconsciousness tugged him under in jerks. She ladled broth into a tin cup and set it near his hand. She took her own on her feet with the shotgun leaned against her thigh. He did not move. The pelts lay in a dark pile by the door, as unreal as money found in snow. June kept finding the line in herself that wanted the easy choice. Lock the door. Take the skins. Let the storm finish him. The line felt like Reed's voice in the back of her skull. She turned from it. When night pressed close on the walls, she spread her thinnest quilt 6 feet from his boots. "That is yours," she said. His lids fluttered, pale eyes under fever cloud. He looked at the blanket, then at her, then back to the fire. He nodded the motion a size too big for him and inched onto it. A strangled sound left him when the bad shoulder took weight. He breathed in long and thin, then went still. June did not undress. She lay on the narrow cot with the greener along the edge, one hand on the cold stock. The room held 2 sounds, wind worrying the seams, the wet hitch of a man pulling air through sickness. Sometime deep he started to make noises, not words at first. A plea caught low in the throat. June opened her eyes to the glow and watched the tension ride his jaw. His right hand curled into a fist and opened. "No," he said soft as if telling someone else, "not again." He jerked hard and sucked breath between his teeth, the pain bright and hot in his face, then went stiff as a board. June sat up. She did not speak. She knew another kind of noise. Reed had filled these nights with slur and spit rage that turned clumsy and then cruel. This was not that sound. This sound went the other direction. It was inward. It made a hollow in the room. She sat until the window frost turned to ghostlight. The fire fell to red bones. The man had gone quiet and too still. June rose the air a knife on her bare wrist when it left the blanket. She nudged his boot. Get up, morning. Nothing. She knelt and put her palm to his forehead, dry furnace heat. She pressed 2 fingers tight to his neck. The pulse answered fast and thin. The shoulder under the crusted fur smelled rancid. Fine, she said to no one. She fed the hearth and set a kettle with clean snow. She dragged the small chest from under the cot and took out the sewing kit, the heavy sail needle, the coil of fishing line, the skinning knife she kept honed bright for pelts. From the shelf she took the bottle Reed had not finished. She swirled it. Enough for pain if pain could be drowned, not enough to waste. She cut the fur away from the wound. The stink hit and sat at the back of her tongue. Cloth had glued to flesh with pus dried to amber. The hole in the meat had gone glossy and angry blue around the black puckered center. The bullet was lodged deep, likely flattened against bone. This is going to hurt, June said. He came awake like a bear out of a trap. His right hand clamped her wrist, grip like iron surprising even through fever. The knife was in her other hand, the edge still dull with lamplight. Look at me, she said, quiet and even. His eyes found her, not recognition. A wildness dilated from heat. Breath hard. The grip tightened once more, then let go. He fell back. He set his jaw as if to bite through it. Name, she said. He swallowed. Colt. June. She folded a rag, drenched it with hot water and whiskey, and pressed it to the wound. He locked and hissed like a struck thing, and then he wrote it, teeth barely parted. She poured whiskey straight into the angry hole. He arched, and a sound came out of him that bent the room. He did not grab her again. His fist found the quilt and never left. She put the knife to the flame and waited until the steel blued. The wind banged once at the south eave. The music box on the shelf sat with its stubborn tick. June turned back knees against the packed earth, breath slow so her hands would follow. She set her left palm firm above the wound and eased the edge in angling for the lead she could not see but could feel with the tip. Colt's breath went short. His good hand opened and closed. The room smelled like sap iron whiskey and smoke. The blade slid against gristle. She kept pressure steady. The metal kissed something flat and hard inside the heat. She took another breath and cut. The blade found the rim of the flattened slug. June eased it free with the tip and let it clink into the tin saucer. Colt blew air between his teeth and went limp all at once. She flushed the wound with whiskey until it ran pale, packed it with the last of her yellow salve, then set stitches with fishing line, each pull neat and tight. The room smelled like iron and sap and old fire. Wind scraped the south eave with that same thin click. When she wound the music box out of habit, it only answered with a stubborn offbeat that did not belong to any song. He slept like a felled tree through the day and into night. June fed him broth that steamed the spoon and left a feather of grease on his lip. He swallowed and slid under again. Sweat soaked the fur at his shoulder and chilled, then heated, then chilled. June sat by the hearth and held his wrist where the pulse ran hard and fast. When it slackened toward dawn, she let her eyes close on the bench and woke to a room blue with cold. 3 days made a rhythm. Fire broth, snow to water, rag to skin. Colt drifted and muttered sometimes, "No, not that way. Let him go." June learned the weight of his quiet as surely as the heft of the greener. She learned how to lift his torso without pulling the stitches, how to cut the shirt, how to fold the quilt so the bad shoulder stayed braced. She learned how to look away when the fever memory dragged his face into a shape that did not belong to his body. On the 4th morning, his eyes cleared. He lay on his side close to the hearthstones and looked at the strip of clean linen wrapped around his shoulder. He looked at the empty cup and the old bottle with only a swallow left. He tried to sit. His jaw set, then loosened. He got there with a slow push of his right arm and sat breathing shallow. "You dug it out," he said. "It was going to take your arm next." June poured water, watched him drink it in 4 measured swallows. His mouth cracked and bled a little. He wiped it with the back of his good hand. She saw how big that hand was. Saw the old scars laid over new. The day came up gray. Colt tugged his coat on with effort. He stood in the doorway and looked at the fence line. "Your south corner does not hold," he said. "It will." "No." He stepped out, then stopped, one hand on the jamb. "Thank you." June snorted without smiling. "Fix something if you need to thank me." He did. He tucked the left arm against his ribs and took the hammer in his right. He worked at the fence where the wind took it first. He did not curse when the post hole floated with slush that iced over while he looked. He chipped it out with the mattock and set the post deeper, then tamped in snow and clay with boot heels. The hammer made an even thud-thud that reached into the room and sat there like a second clock. June found herself breathing to it while she kneaded dough. The music box clicked out of time on the shelf. She stopped winding it. He ate whatever she set in front of him and fell asleep near the fire before the stick burned down. He spoke little. When he did, words came like stones set in a stream, needed to be where they were not more. Water bucket is low. We will cut more kindling. That hinge wants a shim. June heard the quiet between his words, heard a thing that was not boast or swagger. It had weight and stayed where it was put. Reed had been a storm of talk that proved to be smoke when you reached for it. This was the opposite. It was solid. That night the room held more heat than usual. The stew pot fogged the little window and made the rhyme sweat. June unstrung her wool, and her skin prickled with the relief of it. She tied a rope from peg to peg and hung the old quilt across the corner to catch heat. It made a shallow nook. She set the tin tub on the floorboards and poured in hot water that steamed up into her face. The soap smelled faintly of lye and juniper. She stepped out of her shift with her back to the room. Her skin rose in gooseflesh in the draft from the south seam, then eased as she sank into the heat. She washed the grit from her forearms, her neck behind her ears. She felt the pull of his presence the way one feels a loaded sky before snow. The quilt glowed with firelight. Her shadow moved across it, arms lifting and lowering. She tipped her head and unwound her hair. It fell heavy and damp down her back. On the other side, Colt sat on his pallet with his hands on his knees and his eyes down at the flames. He did not hollow the air with a scrape of boot. He did not rise. June listened to her own breath and to the very small sounds behind the quilt. The room drew tight, then eased. She finished quick and quiet, stepped out dried, and pulled her long flannel over wet skin. When she took down the rope, Colt was as he had been. The only sign of strain was the white line of his knuckles. She slept with the greener against the cot edge. She did not lay her hand on it. Snow held for a week, and the sky showed a pale sun. Colt's shoulder went from screaming to a deep ache. He wrapped the bandage himself by the third day, and only grunted once when the cloth stuck. He took the axe and split rounds down to kindling with one-handed blows that were neat and true. He whittled triggers for his traps at the table with a short knife shavings curling like pale ribbon on the boards. June mended a heel on her thickest sock and told him about the wind that howled through the notch when the season turned, and about the way the gullies flooded brown when the thaw ran fast. He nodded. He said nothing that would keep or call anything forward. It was like laying small stones side by side to mark a way you could return along if you needed. 2 nights later, she brought the ledger out from under a loose board beneath the cot. Leather dark with years and hands. The corners had that polish paper gets when it brushes against cloth and time. The ink bled into the fibers where a heavy hand had lingered. June set it on the table and flipped pages to find the uglier ones. Reed's numbers marched along like the tracks of something dumb and heavy. Teeth on cards, bottles, markups in red that bit into the page, a name kept at the side in small, neat letters. Deacon Slate. The ink on the last page had the look of a man who could not hold a pen steady for drink or fear. It read clean enough anyway. Deed of homestead in exchange for forgiveness and cash. Winter occupancy of June for Deacon. Colt stood at the table with his hands flat and the weight set deep through his wrists. He did not touch the book. Slate runs both windows, June said. Land office and bank. If he wants a thing, the paper finds a way. Colt's jaw moved once. Has he come around? He sent this. She did not point to a bruise. She pointed to the page. Reed told me he was thinking about it like he said he thought about everything. Then the horse threw him. He broke his neck on the creek bed. I felt something I do not say out loud. Colt did not look at her. He will send paper before he sends a man. Paper looks clean. That is how this gets done in town. What do you know of town? His mouth twitched, not a smile. Enough to say what I said. The wind laid down the next morning, and the boy from Red Willow came up the track with his scarf frozen to his mouth. He was 19 at most. His ears were red as beets. You June Calloway? I am. From the land office, ma'am. He held out an oiled pouch like it might burn his hand. June took it and let him go. He looked at Colt and looked away fast. He rode out with his shoulders up to his ears. June broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet. The words had weight because of the stamp at the bottom and the printed header at the top. Notice of abandonment pursuant to territorial statute. Property found unoccupied, unimproved, and in arrears. 30 days to appear in person at Red Willow Land Office to prove continuous occupancy and pay outstanding taxes and fees. The number set her throat tight. $40. She felt the old edge slide under her skin and try to seat itself in her neck. She set the paper down, very careful, on the table to keep her hands from shaking. "He knows I cannot get down in this," she said. "He knows I do not have $40. Colt read the page all the way through with his lips moving once, then folded it square and set it back where she had put it. "He is a careful snake," he said. "It is legal." The word sat in the room and hardened. June laughed that dry laugh that told on her more than she wished. They can swear anything true with a stamp. Colt pulled on his coat. He took 2 of the dark otter skins from the pile by the door and the $10 eagle June had not known he carried. He stood in the middle of the cabin and looked large again, like the walls were near. "Where are you going?" "Red Willow." He slid the pelts under his arm. "The clerk will know how to undo a mistake if he is paid to remember what he forgot. You cannot walk into Slate's house." "I do not plan to see Slate. I plan to see a boy who files his papers and wants his own stove at home. Ward Barstow has a way of finding men who do not want to be found." Colt's eyes met hers. The gray had a deeper thing in it today that had nothing to do with fever. "If I see him, I keep moving." June stepped closer, not close enough to touch. "You come back, Colt Avery." He nodded once. It was a real nod that moved his whole face. He saddled the mule in the hard brightness of noon and squinted down the ridge at the white spread of valley. The sound of the hammer at the fence line had set in his bones. June watched from the door, with a hand around the edge of it to keep the wind from grabbing it away. Colt turned his collar up and set off a dark mark against all that white. The sky had that winter blue that belongs on tin and glass. Red Willow crouched in smoke. Colt tied the mule 3 buildings down from the land office and walked with his hat low and his left arm tucked inside the coat. The bell over the land office door gave a cheap cry. The room was warmer than it had any right to be. Ink and hot stove and the sour of boots steamed dry. A narrow boy with a pencil behind his ear and spectacles that made his eyes look too big peered up from behind a tall counter. "Help you." Colt put the 2 otter pelts on the counter and set the eagle piece on top. He kept his body turned to keep his shoulder to the wall. "I am here to correct an error for June Calloway." The boy's face went through 3 changes in the space of one breath. Nervous, then careful, then scared. "Mr. Slate handles those." "I am sure he does. You file the page. Mr. Slate signs it when he gets around to it." Colt slid the pelts half an inch forward with 2 fingers. "This is to thank him for his patience. This is for you to remember you saw me." The boy reached for the coin with a hand that shook. The bell over the door cried again. A man filled the doorway with a long coat and a badge that caught the light. The room seemed to tilt a little. Colt did not move. The man's eyes took in stove counter boy pelts. They found Colt the way a hawk finds a hare that has moved in grass. Sheriff Ward Barstow smiled without warmth and set his hand on the butt of his gun. The room went quiet in a way that made the stove tick loud. Colt did not turn his head. His fingers pushed the pelts and the coin into the clerk's chest. "File it," he said. The boy hugged the bundle by reflex. Barstow's mouth tilted. His right thumb brushed the edge of his holster. Colt walked, not fast, hat low, shoulder to the door. The clerk squeaked and fumbled with a drawer. The bell gave its thin cry again. Cold air bit Colt's face. He hit the hitch rail in 2 long strides, ripped the mule's reins free, and swung up. "Stop," Barstow said behind him, calm as a man ordering eggs. Colt kicked. The mule scrambled on rutted ice, found purchase, and jolted into the street. A shot cracked. The sound slapped off false fronts and came back in strips. Something hissed past Colt's ear and took a splinter from the sign over the smithy. Men shouted. He kept his head low in the valley in front of him. Wind on the ridge bit clean. He rode with his bad arm tucked to his ribs and did not look back. A crow lifted off a fence post and drifted level with him for a few beats black on white. The mule blew hard. The trees opened to the high shoulder where he could see June's cabin crouched against the snow. Smoke from the stovepipe drew thin and steady, the shape of home in a place that did not make room for that word. At the cabin, June heard the first knock before noon. It was not a knock. It was a push that ignored the latch. She stood in the center of the room with the greener held low and steady. The door swung in and brought 2 men with it, both in coats that tried to look respectable and failed at the cuffs. One was tall and narrow in the face. His eyes had color like dishwater. The other was heavy in the shoulders, with hair that looked oily, even in winter light. "Mrs. Calloway," the tall one said. "Tully Griggs, Land Office Inspector." He stepped into the room without wiping his boots. His gaze caught the 2 tin mugs by the hearth, then tracked along the wall to the cot and back to June. A smile that did not reach his eyes. Inspection for what June said. Abandonment, Tully said. Formality. We note occupancy. We note improvements. We note assets. His glove lifted. He brushed a finger over a strand of her hair where it had fallen loose and stuck to her cheek. June moved at the same time her breath left. The twin barrels punched into his belly. She angled down and pulled the right trigger. The blast filled the room and shoved the air out the cracks. The floorboards kicked up in a plume. Splinters stung her shins. Tully screamed and went over a stool, hands grabbing at his leg where the wood had bit. Powder smoke hammered the back of June's throat. The other man froze with his mouth open. Out, June said. She cocked the second hammer. The click cut clean. Tell Deacon Slate I am occupying. They tripped over each other and clawed at the door. Snow took them at the step. Their horses banged into each other, then found their heads and ran down the track crooked. June eased the barrel to the floor and let her arms shake. The smoke thinned. She looked at the fresh hole her shot had torn and felt the room tilt for a breath. She set the greener down by the hearth, reloaded, and barred the door. Her ears rang with a high note that laid itself over the wind. The tick of the music box, still off time, nagged at it. The latch banged long after dark. No courtesy this time. The bar held. June lifted it, and Colt flooded through like someone had opened a dam. Snow caked the brim of his hat. His face was gray under the beard. "Are you hurt?" he said at once. He smelled the powder before he saw the angled hole and the scatter of wood. "2 from Slate," she said. "I told them out." Colt's eyes went to the floor, then to her hands. He exhaled. "Good." She saw the way his shoulders sat. He had ridden too hard for his wound. He looked past her at the fire like a man might look at a spring in summer. He closed the distance and folded her in. No pretty words. The kind of hold you use when the ground under you is not to be trusted. She let him, and then she pulled him close in return. Heat found the places the cold had chiseled. Skin that had not been kind to her learned again what it could be. They did not make it to the cot. The furs by the hearth were warm enough. Morning hit, clear and cruel. Colt stood at the fence line with his hat brim silvered by rime. A rider came up the track in a deputy's badge that was too new for the coat it pinned. The boy had a practiced swagger and eyes that jumped. Colt stepped into his horse's path without raising his voice or his rifle. The deputy's hand fell toward his gun from habit. Colt's knife showed bright, then hit again against the boy's throat so fast it could have been a trick of light. "Message," Colt said. The boy swallowed. Colt felt the movement under the blade. "Mr. Slate says the inspectors found the widow hostile," the boy said. His voice wobbled and tried to be steady. "She has 48 hours to vacate or he will file for assault, and for harboring a wanted man." Colt pressed a hair deeper. A bead of blood rose and sat there. "You tell Slate and you tell Ward Barstow. You tell the 2 hounds he sent that the next boot on this dirt dies, badge or not." The boy nodded too fast. Colt took the knife away. The boy wheeled his horse and went down the track with his heels in a hurry. By noon, the sky went that blank white that hides distance. June checked the stove and laid more splits inside. The room felt smaller. The music box would not shut up its little tick. Colt cleaned his rifle at the table. The action clicked right as rain. His mouth drew tight at the corners. He looked older when he thought he was not being watched. The horses came out of the trees at first in twos, then fanned wide in a half ring. June counted 8, maybe 10. Breath steamed from the animals like smoke from small chimneys. Men in coats that had seen saloons and not much else. 2 sat forward. One had a sling and cold eyes. The other had a neat coat and a face that looked soft until you paid attention to the mouth. Barstow put his horse a few lengths ahead and cupped his hands. "Avery," he called, "you are under arrest for the murder of 2 Wyoming deputies. Come out with your hands high." Deacon Slate rode 2 steps forward. He had a kerchief up against the cold. His voice carried clear anyway. "Mrs. Calloway, you are charged with assault and with harboring a fugitive. Vacate at once. We will put a torch to this structure if you do not comply." Colt looked at June. She had the greener in her hands, her jaw set. "Root cellar," he said. "Now." "No," she said. "My house." Barstow raised a hand. One of his men fired too early and laughed. The window burst into glitter. The shot took bark off the beam behind June. Colt grabbed her at the waist and shoved his body between her and the wall. A second round tore splinters where she had just stood. The third came in flat through the pine and hit Colt high on the right thigh. He made a sound like a man who just lifted more than he could carry and did not want anyone to know the cost. Then he folded. "I am hit," he said through his teeth. June pulled him by his coat and the belt of his pants and got him behind the stone of the hearth. Blood poured with a terrible order to it, not all at once, but in steady pushes. The iron smell climbed her nose and sat there. Her hands went to work before thought. She shoved a folded strip of linen hard into the wound and felt the force of his pulse in her palm. "Hold," she said. She put his hand there and climbed for the shattered window on her elbows. A man ran for the door with a torch. The oil dripped and burned where it fell on the snow. June rose to a knee, liked the sight, and fired the left barrel. The torch spun and died in a hiss. The man did not get back up. The room recoiled with the blast, then settled. June broke the shotgun and fed it by feel. Outside, Slate screamed orders that tripped over each other. Bullets chewed the logs. Dust sifted from the roof seam and came down like brown snow. Colt fumbled at the rifle. His fingers were slick. He could not get the brass to sit in the chamber. He grunted once like a curse and dragged himself so his back set to the stone. His face had lost all color. It still had a line in it like iron. He braced the rifle across his knee and fired twice fast at the shadows on the east side. The shot made holes in men. The shadows fell out of sight. June looked at the pantry door. The lean-to shed behind it held rags and a broken rake and Reed's lamp oil. Her mind made a path and her body took it. She shoved the oil can under her arm and grabbed the tin of matches from the shelf. Colt saw her and shook his head once. "You keep them busy," she said. He lifted the rifle and set his cheek to the stock. "Go." She pushed through the pantry, lifted the latch, and ducked into white. The cold hit like a slap. The world was a shriek of shots and men and horses that stamped at smoke and fear. A bullet snapped the edge of the door and took a curl of wood with it. June slid on one knee, caught herself with a hand, and ran low for the shed. She skidded against the plank wall, splashed oil in a reckless slash, and struck a match. Sulfur bit her nose. Wind tugged at the little flame. She cupped it with both hands, kissed it to the soaked hay, and stepped back. The fire did not start. It jumped. Heat rolled at her in a slap. Smoke rose greasy and black and took to the wind that had gone still all morning. The shed became a source, a black lung that breathed out across the men. They coughed and swore. The circle broke. Figures stumbled like dreamers in fog. Inside, Colt saw the smoke boil and set his jaw. "Good girl," he said under his breath. He pulled the rifle in and waited for shapes to show. One did. A man with a bandage on his shin and hate in his mouth. Tully Griggs came out of the black with a bottle in one hand and a lit rag in the other. He ran for the shed like he meant to burn the world back at it. "No," Colt said. He drew the bead steady on the center of that coat and let out the breath he had left. The rifle bucked, and the man's chest took the round like a door taking a nail. Tully looked down at the spot, confused, then sat in the snow like he had chosen it. He lay back and watched the smoke until it covered him. Colt tried to set another round and could not. The blood had his hand. The room tilted. He let the rifle slide to the floor and closed his eyes because there was no other work he could do with them open. June ran for the pantry door with her hair singed at the tips and the breath in her chest running ragged. She banged through, slid the bar, and turned. Colt lay against the hearth with his face the color of old paper. The bandage on his thigh had gone from white to red all the way through. She dropped to her knees so fast the boards bit them. Outside, the voices changed. Slate's voice rose thin. Barstow's cut it. Boots hit snow. The steps came for the porch. The latch trembled. June put her back to the door and set the greener across her lap. The smoke from the shed pushed at the little room through every seam. The music box on the shelf clicked off time. The fire cracked once and sent up a shower of sparks that died before they touched the iron. The latch shook like a caught animal. Boots thumped the porch. A hand struck the wood near June's head. The room had the sharp taste of oil smoke and pine pitch. June set the greener level and waited for the board to split. A distant thunder rolled up the draw from the east. Not weather. Horses, many coming hard. A voice carried through the thin air with the weight of a man who ran cattle through storms and did not ask permission. "Deacon Slate, call your curs off that door." Another voice answered closer, clipped and vicious. "This is law. Stand down." "Law does not ride with a torch to a widow's eve," the first voice said. "You try that door and you meet rifles." The boots on the porch hesitated. Men turned their heads. June lifted the bar and cracked the door with her shoulder still against it. Cold flung itself inside. Through the smoke, she saw shapes on the ridge line. 7 riders spread in a clean skirmish line, coats flaring, barrels steady. Mick Haviland sat the big bay in the center hat, stiff with frost. Barstow raised his pistol. A single rifle spoke from Mick's line. The shot tore Barstow's sleeve, and the wounded arm jerked. He cursed and gripped his elbow. He saw two of his men down in the snow. He saw the black smoke thicken. He looked to Slate. Slate had already turned his horse. "This is not done," Barstow shouted toward the cabin. "Avery, you hear me." They pulled back in a churning of hooves and breath. The shed yawned out smoke as the wind freshened and tore it to dirty rags across the trees. Silence fell too fast after all that noise. June slid the bar back and fell to her knees by Colt. "Hold," she said, though his eyes were closed and his lips had gone gray at the edges. Mick's boots hit the porch. He came in without asking. He looked around once, took in the torn floorboard, the hole in the window, the blood, the man by the hearth. His jaw set. "Doc is snowed west," he said. 3 days, maybe 4. "He does not have ours," June said. Her voice came out as a thing without shape. "Help me." Mick set the lantern on the table and turned the wick up until the glass glowed. He washed his rope-calloused hands with the last of the hot water without comment. The room took on a new smell. Heat, iron, faint soap. June found the knife, the needle, the coil of line. She poured whiskey into a tin and threw a look at the small brown bottle of her willow tincture. She did not waste time on doubt. Mick knelt at Colt's thigh and ripped the cloth away. The wound pumped steady. June leaned in with both hands pressed hard and felt the pulse resist her. Mick took a breath and let it out slow, then put his big palm on top of hers so she could shift and reach for the knife. "Tell me," Mick said, calm as if they were fixing a harness. Deep, June said. "Hi, I think it missed the bone. It took the vessel. Then we tie it." She heated the knife in the heart of the flame until the edge turned a faint blue. She passed the steel into the whiskey and shook the drops off. Colt did not stir. His breath rasped shallow under everything. "Ready," Mick said. He took his hand away. Blood climbed fast. June opened the cut wider with the point and watched for the well that mattered. It showed itself a dark mouth that pushed with each beat. June slid the small hook she had bent from a fish barb into the edge and lifted. The artery rolled and tried to flee. She caught it with the sailing needle threaded with line and passed once, twice. Mick's fingers were right there, as steady as a fence post, keeping the quivering lengths apart so the loop could go clean. June drew it tight and the push slowed. She tied again. The world narrowed to tremor to breath. The push stopped. June sagged back on her heels. Her face was wet and hot, though the room was cold. The lantern haloed the edge of the knife. The pellets on the hearth snapped once and fell to ash. Mick took the bottle, tipped a good measure into his mouth, then poured the rest over the wound. Colt flinched based on some stubborn engine that still ran down inside. "Good," Mick said. "Stitch him." She sewed him shut in neat bites. The thread creaked through living meat. Her hands did not shake until she cut the last knot and laid clean cloth down and bound it tight with a strip torn from her own sheet. She sat on the floor and did not move. Colt's chest lifted, fell, lifted, thank God. Mick moved around the room without asking where things were. He rebuilt the fire-fed the mule, forked the last of the hay to the animals. He pushed a plank across the shot-out window and braced it against the table. When he came back to the hearth, his voice had moved a register down. "You want him alive through night," he said. "You keep him warm. You watch that bandage. If it goes through, you bind again." "I will not sleep," June said. Mick's mouth ticked. "You say that now." He left after he made sure the porch was clear and that the tracks down the draw showed retreat, not return. One of his men stayed by the fence with a rifle on his lap and the reins in his fist. June sat on the floor and held Colt's hand. She told him things that had no shape, either things she thought were lost in her. She said the creek sounded different in spring. She said the marsh marigold came earlier on the south bank. She said the kitchen would smell like wet flour and yeast when the first bread rose right. She said the word home without choking. The music box ticked from the shelf. It was stubborn and wrong. She let it be wrong and kept talking until the lamp oil guttered. She fed the wick with a touch. She fed the fire. She did not close her eyes for more than a blink. When dawn dusted the window plank and laid a stripe across the floor, Colt's fever broke. His skin went from furnace hot to cold in a hurry that scared her more than heat ever had. She tucked the blanket tight and slid under to give him what little warmth she had left. His breath was a very small sound. Then it was a better one. Then his eyes opened. June tipped water into his mouth. He swallowed and looked at her like she had moved a long way while he slept, and he needed to see if she was still where she belonged. He saw the ash on her cheek and the new raw crack on her knuckle. He looked at the gray bandage and the neat line of stitches. He tried to say a thing and failed. June shook her head and laid her palm on his forehead. He closed his eyes and the corner of his mouth lifted. 2 days later, a wagon rolled up from the east with 2 riders and a long shadow riding ahead of it. The man on the high seat had a sheet of paper in his gloved hand and wore his badge at the center of his chest. Another man, small and pale, with eyes too big behind wire rims, sat beside him and would not look at anything that breathed. "Mrs. Calloway," the badge said. "Harlan Pierce, Territorial Marshal." June stepped aside. Mick came from the fence and stood at the corner with his thumb on the line of his belt. The rider by the wagon watched the ridge line and not the door. The marshal stepped into the room and looked with a soldier's eye. One hole boarded. Blood scrubbed from the floor with sand that still left a rust shadow. A man on the pallet by the hearth. A woman who did not move out of his way but did not bar him either. "We had business in Red Willow this morning," Marshal Pierce said. His voice was plain. It involved Mr. Deacon Slate and Sheriff Ward Barstow. "This here is Ephraim Whitcomb. He works for Slate. He has a memory that has improved today. He's going to tell everything he told me." The clerk spoke like a boy at a whipping post. He told papers filed with lies. He told of notices printed before winter. He told of coin that moved across desks when the stove was too hot for the room, and names that were written in the wrong places on purpose. He told how Barstow sent letters across the line to make the noose legal. He stuttered when he reached the part about men riding out with torches. Marshal Pierce listened until the man ran out of breath, then held up the folded sheet he had brought. "This is a warrant," he said. "Not for you, for Slate, for Barstow, conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder. We will hold court here if I have to, but I prefer a room with benches." Mick smiled without showing teeth. June felt something in her chest drop an inch lower. It felt like weight put on a solid shelf. 2 days later, the front of the Grange Hall held more men than it had space. Town had come out to see what was black and what was white when the ashes settled. June sat on a front bench with Mick beside her. Ephraim Whitcomb told his story again and found more words each time. He passed the ledger from June's house to the marshal, and the marshal held it up so the room could see where red ink bled. Deacon Slate's face went a shade lighter for every page. Ward Barstow sat with his arm in a sling and his mouth a hard line. He stared at Colt, as if eyes could make a rope when men could not. Marshal Pierce called Colt Avery to the stand. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Colt stood with both hands on the rail and swore. He sat because his leg would not let him do otherwise. He looked at the marshal, and then at the wood of the table, and then at Barstow. He told about a job in the Bighorns. He told about a boy named Jamie who ran because he believed someone would listen if he lived. He told how it was easy money if dead counted the same as alive. He said the number. $60. He said the way it had sat in his belly after and turned hot. He said how he came back when the money felt heavy like iron in his pocket, and asked questions that no one wanted asked. He said what happened in a saloon when men who wore badges found they had no law to cover what they had done. He told who fell and who did not. His voice did not climb. It did not fall. It held to a line a man could drive a fence on. When he stepped down, the room did not speak. It did not need to. The marshal read the findings like a man reading the weather that was already on your skin. The words guilty came simple and without flourish. The sentence came with the same weight. The date for the hanging was set on a clean piece of paper. Afterward, in the thin light at the edge of town, Marshal Pierce found Colt at the mule. "You did right," Pierce said. "You cleared a dead boy's name. You cleaned a dirty corner." "What does it buy me?" Colt said, not unkindly. "A day," Pierce said. "Wyoming sent wires. They still claim you for 2 deputies that wear Barstow's stink. The new sheriff has no interest in my trouble. I will hold you on as a witness no more than 24 hours. When that sun comes again, if you are still here, I arrest you." Colt nodded and did not argue. He touched the mule's neck. The animal flicked an ear and leaned into the rub. June stood by the smithy where the heat bled out to the road. She walked to him because there was no more ground to give and no more ground to take. He looked like the man who had knocked at her door that first night, and also like someone else who had learned a different way to breathe. "I brought this to your threshold," Colt said. "You brought me out of it," June said. "You brought me breath in my own house." He did not have words for that. He bent until his forehead touched hers and stayed there. His hand found her jaw. Her mouth found his, and the kiss was not sweet. It was a brand. It made a claim that paper could not. Her hands bunched in his coat and pulled until he had to bend lower or tear the cloth. She broke away first because breath had to get in. "You come back," she said. "I do not care how that looks to anyone." He could not say the word that stood in his throat. He nodded once. Then he swung up and turned south. The mule stepped into the road, and the road took him. He did not look behind. June stood until the cold pricked the corners of her eyes. The town noise went around her like a river around a stone. Behind her, the smithy hammer rang once and then again. The sound climbed the air and reached the ridge where smoke from her little stovepipe would rise when she lit it. She closed her hand until her nails bit her palm, then let go. The winter sky held a thin coin of sun over the pass. Snow let go slow. It sank and thinned and pulled back from the fence posts, as if it had changed its mind. The south eave still clicked when the wind swung around a small sound in a larger quiet. June boiled sand with lye and scrubbed the floor where blood had burned its mark. It never went fully out. It faded to a rust ghost. She left it. Mick brought 2 hands and a wagon of plank pine. They patched the window with a fresh frame that still smelled sweet. They skinned over the worst of the splintered boards by the hearth. On the ridge, Mick's men took turns with rifles until the tracks around the draw told a clean story. Then they went back to cattle and fences. Mick tipped his hat and left a sack of flour that felt heavier than its weight. June worked. She stitched her sheet back into strips and washed them and rolled them tight for a next time she refused to name. She stacked the otter pelts and rode down to Red Willow with her jaw set and her eyes forward. She sold the stack to a buyer who kept glancing past her at the door like Slate might walk in from hell and ask for them back. She walked out with a cloth roll of bills and 2 spools of thread and a new axe head wrapped in brown paper. At home, she set posts from the cut of pine Mick left and listened to the hammer find its rhythm again. Thud, thud, not a battle this time. A cadence. She fenced off a square of earth for a garden and set her boot prints around it like a fence inside the fence. She bought 2 red hens from a ranch wife down the valley who pressed eggs into her hands as if June might refuse the extra. She took the piglet with a striped back that squealed like it would rather be anywhere else and fed it scraps until it learned her voice. Marshall Pierce came up the draw on a day as clean as glass. The snow had broken off the willows in wet handfuls and the sky rang. He carried no shackles, only a folded paper with a seal that caught the sun. Ephraim Whitcomb sat beside him and looked like a man who had not slept well since words left his mouth in a room full of men. 2 deputies had Slate between them on mules with ears back and eyes rolling. Barstow rode in irons with his sling gray with dirt. He kept his gaze straight ahead, as if a look would cost him blood. Pierce swung down and held out the paper. His gloves creaked. "Your deed," he said. "Signed and clean, taxes recorded, occupancy sworn and witnessed. This land is yours." June took it with both hands. The paper had weight and a smell of ink and wax. Her name sat in the center like a foot planted. She felt the ground answer up through her boots. She did not trust her voice. She nodded once. Pierce tipped his hat and did not try to say a thing that was not his to say. He put his boot back in the stirrup and turned his horse. The town hung the 2 men the next week. June did not go. She baked bread and then burned the first loaf because she stood too long at the door and watched the ridge. She fed the second loaf to Mick's dog when the man rode by on his way to the river and would not admit he had tethered his horse too close for a reason. Late summer brought dust and heat and blue flies. The creek ran thin and fast and green things browned at the tips. The boy from the post finally found his way to June's steps with a letter that had come from the far side of the line. He had trouble leaving. He wanted to know if she knew a man who answered to 3 names and whether he was big like a door. She gave him a heel of bread and a slice of bacon and read the 3 lines 3 times. "I am here. They are not. I think of the hearth." She folded the rough paper and slid it under the ledger on the shelf. The old music box sat beside it. She wound it from habit. The busted thing gave it stubborn tick and no tune. June smiled at it like it were a chicken with a crooked feather. It had fought for its bad note so long it felt like part of the room. Fall edged in with cool mornings and smoke that went straight up. The leaves along the creek flipped their pale sides at any wind that bothered. June traded mending and meals to Mick's hands for 3 days of framing and nails. They raised a proper barn by the fence where the drifts piled shallowest boards spaced for light rafters pegged tight. When the last pin went home, the hammer sound hung in the air and then stopped. The quiet after felt earned. She set a cot in the loft for nights when the heat stayed in the hay longer than it stayed in the cabin. She hauled sacks of feed up the ladder and stacked them by weight and habit. Dust from new lumber drifted through the slats and strips where sun came and laid it across the floor. It made everything gold. She was there one noon with a fork of hay and the smell of cut grass up in her nose when Shadow crossed the barn door. It blocked the light in a way her body knew before her mind did. Her hand went to the small knife at her belt and stayed there. The man stepped out of the glare. He was thinner and his beard was gone. A thick mustache sat on his lip neat as a line of stitching. His coat was clean, but not new. His hat rode low. He carried nothing in his hands. His eyes were the same gray that had watched a fire as if it were a map. "You have been busy," he said. His voice carried that gravel that had sat in it even when fever took the rest. June did not move. He took 2 more steps into the barn and lifted his hands where she could see them. "My name," he said, careful as if he had practiced it, "is John North. The marshal saw to papers. The other man is dead." June came down the ladder without missing a rung. She crossed the hay and stopped close enough to smell the road on him. Dust leather a skinned place on his knuckles. He stood steady. She planted her open palm flat against his chest and hit once. The sound cracked in the warm air. "You are late," she said. He dropped his chin and took the blow and the word like he had been waiting to be given them. He did not argue the clock. June caught his shirt in both fists and pulled. He bent. Her mouth found his. His hands went to her waist and tightened as if the floor were not to be trusted. He lifted her as if she weighed no more than a bag of feed and climbed the ladder with a body that had learned again how to carry itself. She did not let go. They lay in the striping of light and shadow, the hay-pricked skin that did not mind. He set his head on her chest and breathed there until the breathing was the loudest thing in the barn. She looked at the dust turning in the beams and at the rafters that met clean. The old box in her cabin had been wound that morning without thought. She could hear it, even hear a ghost of a tick in her ear. It found a note for the first time since she could remember. Not a tune, just a clear single sound that landed and held. He lifted his head and grinned without showing teeth. One night he said, 10 pelts. June ran her fingers through the short hair that felt strange under her hand and right anyway. She touched the edge of his mustache with a thumb. She kissed it to be sure. "You owe me more than that," she said. "I am set on collecting." He rolled to his side and pulled her with him. The barn spoke in small creaks as sun slid a little toward afternoon. Outside, the pig kicked the trough and one of the red hens scolded at nothing. Inside, the quiet took shape. It settled into the boards. It found the space between heartbeats and made room. Later, they climbed down together and crossed to the cabin. June set the deed on the table where the light could touch the seal. She slid the ledger under it. The page with red ink lay against the clean paper with her name in black. The wind on the ridge moved and did not find a seam. The south eave did not click. The hammer leaned where she had left it and did not need to speak. The fire took when she touched match to kindling. The smoke went up true. He sat on the bench with his bad legs stretched and his hands open on his knees. She set a tin mug by his hand and her own beside it. The music box ticked once and twice. Then it found that same clear note and held it longer. June sat and crossed her feet under the bench and felt the floor answer back through the boards. He looked at her. She looked at him. The room had heat. The door had a bar. The snow, where it waited in shadows, could wait a while longer. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.